We are in Pirkei Avos, 4th chapter, Mishnah Yud Beis, the 12th Mishnah. And this Mishnah is attributed to Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. So we'll take a moment just to become familiar with who he is. Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. Particularly one thing about his life that's going to lead directly into the 3 points of this Mishnah. And there's some very valuable lessons in this Mishnah. This is a Mishnah about how to deal with other people. So firstly, who's Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua? He was one of the students of Rabbi Akiva. Now, that's not surprising. Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 students. It's quite likely that many of the rabbis of the time would have been his students. But what is significant is, he is one of the 5 students who survived after all the other students passed away in that infamous plague that eradicated the entire school of Rabbi Akiva's students. So that tells you something. He obviously was a special person in the league of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, those people who pulled through. He was a Kohen. And that is also significant, as we'll see in a moment, not as significant as the part that I want to tell you. He was considered a tremendous scholar. He was one of the teachers of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who compiled the Mishnah. And he lived to the age of 105. Now, let's pause on that for a moment, because there are 2 elements to that statement. He lived to the age of 105, so we're impressed. Somebody who lived that long. There were other sages at that time who lived longer. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai lived to 120. So it's, not such a surprise yet. We also find that many of the rabbis at the time didn't live that long, and so there's a conversation that appears frequently in the Gemara, B'meher achta yomim. What was your secret of longevity? And they asked Rabbi Elazar this question, what was your secret of longevity? That's the one side of the story. The other side of the story is, you might remember recently, about a week or 2 ago, there was a Holocaust victim who passed away after having been attacked a few months ago. And people were saying what a terrible thing to have survived the Holocaust and then to have died because of a modern day assault, anti-Semitic incident. So can you imagine a person who lives to 105 and then at the end was murdered by the Romans? Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua is one of the Asara Harugei Malchus, one of the 10 famous sages who were murdered by the Romans. In his case, it was on a Friday night. He was in the middle of saying Kiddush, and a Roman legionnaire came into the room as he was making Kiddush and killed him there in front of his family. And he was at the point where we say in the Kiddush, Asher bara Elokim la'asois, that which Hashem had created, la'asois, for us to do. When he said the word Elokim, it was exactly at that moment that he was killed. And so the Gemara tells us that was a sign of a very righteous individual, that the last word on his mouth, the last word on his lips was Hashem's name. So, but still there's this strange irony of living to 105 and then being one of the people murdered by the Romans. So his students asked him, B'meher achta yomim, what was your secret? What's your secret of longevity? And he told them a few things. We're going to focus on 2. One of them is he was a Kohen. Now, a Kohen is not necessarily automatically a guarantee for long life. In fact, one of the things we know about Kohanim is that in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, they were actually quite sickly people, because they had to work under very difficult circumstances. They had to walk around barefoot on the cold floor. I'm sure their mothers were not impressed with that. And they had to eat food that wasn't always fully cooked, because they were zrizin. And one of the things of a Kohen is that they did everything very quickly, and when they would eat the portions from the korbanos, they wouldn't wait for it to be fully cooked. So there was a full-time medic assigned to the Kohanim. So the fact that he was a Kohen is not the reason he had a long life. But he said that as a Kohen, what does a Kohen have to do? What's the one thing a Kohen has to do even today? Bless people. So that was his thing. He always used the opportunity to bless people with Birkas Kohanim, with the Baruch of the Kohanim, but he always made sure, before saying Birkas Kohanim, to always say the bracha that precedes it. Asher kitshanu b'kedushasa shel Aaron v'tzivanu levarech es Amo Yisrael b'ahava. The blessing, which is that we were instructed to extend brachas to the Jewish people, b'ahava, with love. And that becomes one of the themes of Rabbi Elizabeth and Shammua. Here's a person who looked to express an opportunity, at every opportunity, looks to express love of his fellow Jew. That's relevant to the story. The other thing that he did is, he said he never stepped over the heads of his students. Okay, so please God, I think if that's the case, all of us who teach in the modern world are also headed for a long life, because we also don't step over the heads of our students, right? In fact, I'm sure you're wondering, why would anybody step over the heads of their students? Why would you do such a thing? So let's picture the scene. How did the yeshivas look in those days? We're very used to this setup, right? You get a nice comfortable chair, you get a table, maybe you get a coffee if you're really good at this. How was it in those days? Everybody's on the floor. We learned that already in the first chapter. That the way you learn Torah is you sat on the floor in the dust of your rabbi's feet. And you can imagine that certain rabbis, like Rabbi Elizabeth and Shammua, their shiur was very popular. So you can imagine the room was packed. So he always made sure to get there early enough that he'd be there before any of the students arrived. So he would never have to pick his way through the crowd who was sitting on the floor. And not like he'd actually step over their heads, but even weaving his way through the crowd past the people, he felt would be disrespectful to the students, so he never did it. So he'd always arrive first, and he'd always leave last, to ensure that he never showed any kind of disrespect to the students. And that's going to fit directly with the three things he's going to teach us in this Mishnah. The three things that he teaches us, at first glance, when you read them, you're going to think, wow, this is so nice. This is exactly what Judaism espouses. This is how Jews are supposed to think, which is true. What we're going to try to do, though, today is to explore another layer of depth to the three things, that at least two of the three that he's teaching us, which hopefully will totally shift our understanding of how we're supposed to react to other people. By way of introduction, before we do that, before we read what Rabbi Elazar has to say, I'd like to share something that you are very familiar with. And that is the prophecy or the vision of the prophet Yeshaya about a certain group of angels called Seraphim. Everybody know the Seraphim? Yes, we know. No, we don't. We know of the Seraphim. We don't know the Seraphim, right? So we know of the Seraphim. So what do the Seraphim do? What are they famous for? They what? They carry our prayers. Okay, there are other angels that also are involved with carrying our prayers. What's the most famous thing that we know about Seraphim? They say Kadosh, 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 right? That's what's famous about the Seraphim. And that's the vision that the prophet Yeshaya has, that these are these spiritual beings who proclaim Hashem's greatness with a threefold expression. Holy, holy, holy. I'll never forget the very first time that I ever heard Chief Rabbi Harris Alav Shalom speak. That's what he spoke about. And we didn't realize that. We were in high school at the time. We didn't realize that he had a Scottish accent. So he started his speech speaking about huli, huli, huli. And we didn't know what that was. So these are the Seraphim. They say holy, holy, holy. Very nice. Okay, great. It's very beautiful. What else does Yeshaya tell us about the Seraphim? What do they look like? Anybody know what Seraphim look like? 6 wings. That's what I was looking for, right? They have 6 wings. Now, of course we understand that any description of angels is obviously non-literal. Obviously. But not only is it non-literal, it's completely impractical. Now, when you think of 6 wings, maybe you think of a dragonfly or something like that, that's got a whole bunch of wings. But the way that the vision of Yeshaya describes it, these wings are completely impractical. Bishtayim yechaseh fanov, 2 of the wings cover their face. Bishtayim yechaseh raglov, 2 of the wings cover their feet. Uvishtayim ya'oifeif, and 2 of the wings are for flying. That's strange. Aren't wings for flying? What do you mean? There are wings to cover your face, and there's wings to cover your feet, and then there's wings to fly. So let's go back a step. How do you say wings in Hebrew? Kenafayim, right? And what else could a kanaf mean besides kenafayim, besides wings? What else could a kanaf mean? Al kanfei bigdeihem, the Torah tells us. You put tzitzis, al kanfei, on the hem, on the fringe of your garments, right? That's one possibility. But here's another possibility of what it means. In the future, the prophet Yeshaya also tells us, in the time of Mashiach, V'loi yikanef, there's the same word, V'loi yikanef oid moirecha, your guide will no longer be shielded. And your eyes will see your guide, referring to Hashem. So the word kanaf could also mean a shield or something that covers. So the prophet Yeshaya is telling us that the nature of these seraphim is that they have two so-called wings to cover their face, two to cover their legs, or singular leg, and two to move. And that's a fascinating description of how spiritual progress works. Because everything that we're described, everything we're given about the spiritual realms is not for interest's sake. It's not like we go on a spiritual safari. Oh, look there's the seraphim, very rare sighting. They're definitely part of the spiritual big five. If you get to see the seraphim, it's a big deal. It's not like that. If we're given this description, it's because it has relevance to us in our lives. There are other things about the angels we're never told because they're irrelevant to us. So here we've got a template for spiritual progress. Spiritual progress is depicted by those wings that make you fly, because we want to be able to move, and we want to be able to move in an upward direction. That's why it's wings, that's why it's flying, because we're looking to rise, we're looking to progress. And the implication of wings is that you're not necessarily going step by step by step. You can actually go in leaps and bounds, like the Gemara says. There's a whole debate in the Gemara how far each angel can go in a single bound, in a single leap. So the two wings of flight, they represent our spiritual development and our spiritual growth. Now, I think everybody will agree that's a big part of our lives. We want to grow spiritually. Now, in order to grow spiritually, what do you need first? And the truth is, it's not unique only to spirituality. If you want to move in anything in life, what do you need first before you move? You need what? Inspiration. That's to get you to move. That's true. You need something to propel you. What else do you need before you can move? Let's go back to the metaphor of flight. So let's say you're a commercial pilot. What do you need before you... Thrust is the inspiration, right? So before you do that, what do you need? Fuel and you need? You need a course. Yes, you need an airplane. That's true, right? You need to know where you're going. If you don't know where you're going, as Yogi Berra would famously say, you'll end up somewhere else. So if you don't know where you're growing towards, how do you ever know if you're growing? So therefore, one of the most important things in spiritual development is you have to have a sight set on something higher than yourself, an aspirational goal. That's what you need, right? You need an aspirational goal. So before you flap those wings, you need panav. You need your face headed in a particular direction. Because you could fly with all the force in the world. If the direction is wrong, then it's a futile exercise. So first thing you need is your panav. You need your panim. Your face has to be directed in the correct way. Then you need your legs. You got to protect your legs. Why do you have to protect your legs? What do legs represent in spirituality? It's what? Movement, balance. It's funny that you say balance. Balance actually in spirituality is always associated with your arms, right? If you think about it, I don't know if a person's ever had an arm in a sling. Have you ever had an arm in a sling? What's the first thing that they warn you after they put your arm in a sling? Be careful that you don't fall. Because once one arm is immobile, your sense of balance is completely thrown out. So legs are more stability than balance. And legs are considered the part of us that connects us with the material world. That's what touches the ground. It's part of me that touches the ground. I'm not like an animal. Animals are all four elements on the ground. But with us, only the legs touch the ground, and specifically the feet. So that represents the part of us that is invested in this world. By the way, Hebrew letters represent exactly this. There's the middle base of all Hebrew letters. Certain letters extend above the line, so those are the aspirational letters. And certain letters descend below the line. Those are the letters that talk about how the spirituality is supposed to engage the world. And that's why, for example, which is the longest letter of all below the line is a final nun, right? And nun is the one letter that is left out of Ashrei, because nun represents noifel. You get too caught up in the world. You get dragged down too far. Okay? All right, subject for another conversation. But the point is that there are three dimensions that we operate in. The aspirational, the practical, and then you've got to be very careful of what might drag you down. So, the seraphim, they cover their faces and they cover their legs. They cover their faces, that's a sense of humility. It's not about me. It's about hearing where I need to go. Rather than me saying, I think this is what I need. One of the most important things for a person to grow spiritually is to cover your face and say, I'm not going to be the guide of the next level. I have to hear from something or someone who is at a higher level and let them guide me. So I cover my face in a sense as if to say I'm in a space of humility. I cover my legs for one of two reasons. Either because I need to shield myself from the physicality of this world, that it doesn't drag me down. Or if I am a teacher, which we all are to a greater or lesser extent, I have to shield myself that I don't overwhelm the student to the point that the student feels inadequate. So I have to shield, because that's sometimes what teachers can do, right? They can overwhelm. Too much information, too much expectation, too much demand on the student. And then the student gets, oh my gosh, I can't do this. And they pull back. So you have to know how to shield. Whereas me, I'm the person in the middle, I have to always be in a state of movement, always growing and developing. So with that introduction, we can now look at the three things that Rabbi Elizabeth teaches us. Number one, he's teaching from the bottom up. First, he teaches us, Yehi kavoid talmidcha, the honor or respect for your student. Yehi kavoid talmidcha, chaviv alecha keshelach. Should be as beloved to you as your own respect. Now you can see that modeled in Rabbi Elizabeth. What's his big thing that he says why he lived so long? Because he showed so much respect to his students. He wouldn't even walk into the room in such a way that may have allowed them to feel in any way inadequate. So this is a lived value rather than just a preached value. So that's number one. The honor that you give to your students should be as cherished to you as your own honor. Then he says, the respect that you give to your contemporary, to your peer, to your friend, that should be kemoira rabach, like the reverence that you show to your teacher. Or moira rabach kemoira shamayim. And the reverence that you show to your teacher should be like the reverence that you show to Hashem himself. At first glance, it may sound a little confusing, because if you don't really break this into segments, it sounds like he's effectively saying they're all the same. That's what it sounds like. So, treat your student like you would yourself, treat your friend like you would your teacher, treat your teacher like you would Hashem. So, it's like a mathematical equation. If x equals y equals z, so x equals z, right? So, if honoring your peer is supposed to be like fear of your teacher, and fear of your teacher is supposed to be like fear of heaven, then surely you're saying that the honor of your friend is like the fear of heaven. It's not that simple at all. It's very nuanced. What he's telling us over here is very nuanced. First of all, let's understand, where do we know this from? Let's start with that. Where do we know that it's an appropriate principle that you treat a student with the kind of respect that you'd give yourself? Now, every one of these three, like anything else in the Mishnah, must have a biblical source. So where in the Torah do we see an example of a great person in the Torah who showed that kind of respect to their student? Moshe and Yoshua, yes? Where do we have Moshe and Yoshua doing that? Exactly. So at the time, remember that there was the story of the nation of Amalek who ambushed the Jewish people just as they left Israel, just as they left Egypt, right? They were very exposed, and the Amalek people attacked them. And Moshe turns to Yoshua. This is the first time that we encounter Yoshua in the Torah. Just for fun. Just for fun. Anyone want to take a guess how old Yehoshua was at this point? Because it will be relevant to working out how old he is when he leads the Jews into Israel. Ballpark figure, where would you put him? Right? Not bad. He was 40 something. Which means that by the time he becomes the leader of the Jews going into Israel, he's effectively the same age that Moshe was when he became the leader of the Jews, which is quite interesting. So anyhow, so Moshe now turns to Yoshua and he says, we've got to wage war against Amalek, and I want you to lead the war. So what does he say to him? Vayomer Moshe el Yehoshua, Bechar lonu anoshim. Choose men for us. Now he didn't have to say that. He didn't have to equate Yehoshua with himself. So from here we learn, you're supposed to equate your students' honor with your own honor. That's why he put them both into the same phrase, and he called Yehoshua us. Yehoshua and Moshe together, us. Now you can imagine Yehoshua must have been completely bowled over by that, because Yehoshua had to have been the most dedicated student we find in history. So it's an incredible moment where he says, B'chal lanu, choose for us people. Okay, great. So there's an example that you treat your student with the respect that you'd reserve for yourself. Any idea where we see that you treat your contemporary with the same kind of respect that you should give your Rebbe, your teacher? Anybody know where we find evidence of that? So let's try to think. Who would be the most classic biblical contemporaries? It's easier than you think. Moshe and Aaron. Moshe and Aaron. Now what happens with Moshe and Aaron? So we know that Aaron is older than Moshe, which means that it is appropriate at any time for Aaron to expect some degree of respect from his younger brother Moshe. Now we know that there's a very bitter moment in their history where, because of that sense of the younger sibling, things went very pear-shaped. And that was with Miriam, right? When Miriam spoke out against Moshe, her younger brother, who, by the way, was only alive because of her, twice. Once because she convinced her parents to get back together, so he was born. Secondly, because she was the one who protected him when he was thrown into he was placed into a basket in the river. So, not just the younger sibling who owes her his life, yet when she spoke out against him, she was punished. Aaron then goes to Moshe and says, whoa, you got to do something over here. This is your sister. You have to daven to Hashem to release the tzara'as, the punishment she's experiencing. So what does he say? In fact, it's such a powerful line, we incorporate it into our slichus that we say before Rosh Hashanah. What does he say? Before that, Vayomer, Bi Adoini, please my master. Can you imagine? Think for a second about your own siblings. Who's running? Forget about that. Think about your own kids and how they speak to each other. Can you imagine saying, Bi Adoini, my master? And from that we learn that you are supposed to show such reverence for somebody who's your contemporary as if they were your teacher. Okay, fascinating. And where do we know that you're supposed to have reverence of your teacher like reverence of heaven itself? Where do we know that? From the first pair, Yehoshua and Moshe. So the first time was Moshe relating to Yehoshua, and this time it's Yehoshua relating to Moshe. What happened? So we know the story that when Moshe had to share his divine radiance with the 70 elders, we know that two people began to give prophecy at the time, Eldad and Medad. And what they said was very disconcerting, because they said that Moshe is going to pass away and Yehoshua is going to lead the Jews into Israel. So what did Yehoshua do when he heard that? What would any normal person do? That's great news. Okay, I'll start preparing, for when I take over, start making plans. What does Yehoshua do? He runs straight to Moshe and he says to Moshe, Adoini Moshe Kilaim. Moshe davened that they should be terminated. Why? Because they had said something against his Rebbe. They had said that his Rebbe was going to die. And that was unacceptable. And he felt that if somebody would say something against Hashem, it would be a capital offense. So likewise, if you say something against my teacher, it's a capital offense. So he went and he asked Moshe to daven that they should be terminated. Of course, Moshe's attitude was different. And Moshe said, on the contrary, halavai, every Jewish person would be a Navi. That would be amazing if every Jewish person was a prophet. Okay, so there are our three examples. Now let's understand what's going on over here. One of the fascinating insights, there's a commentary on Pirkei Avos called the Yochim. So one of the fascinating insights that he develops is this principle. He says, at the end of the day, the way that human beings are designed is that we're all half shekels. Right, this Shabbos is going to be Parshas Shkolim, right? The half shekel. We're all half shekels, which essentially means, how they say it in marriage. How they describe it in marriage is that a man, before he is married, is only half a man. And then once he is married, he's finished. So we're all kind of unfinished products, right? We all rely on each other. We're symbiotic beings. We rely on each other. No person can survive alone. As the expression goes, the cliche, right? No man is an island. So we all need people in our lives. And if you examine what Rabbi Elizabeth and Shammua is telling us, we actually need three kinds of people in our lives. We need guides and mentors, teachers. We need peers, people we can relate to. This is similar to what we learned in the first parak. Asay lechorav, you have to establish for yourself a teacher. Ukenei lechachaver, and you have to have a friend, a good friend. Somebody WhatsApped me, it's quite ironic, somebody WhatsApped me at some unearthly hour this morning to say, this is a person who often sends me jokes and memes and things like that. So some crazy hour sends me a message. What is the definition of a good friend? Someone you can call at 4 a.m. and they'll take your call. So I don't know if I'm no longer a good friend because I only saw the message a few hours later. So we need a friend. We don't need a million friends. We need a friend, because one of the parts of our lives that completes us is a person who is on our level, on our wavelength, with whom we can not just socialize, but much more importantly, learn and grow. Remember, the goal is your faith. We want to keep spiritually mobile. And the third thing that we all need, and this is something we don't necessarily think about, we all need somebody to learn from us. Those are the three stages of spiritual development. Panov, Raglov, and your faith. Something that you look towards with aspiration. Something that is less than yourself that you look to raise, and someone who is with you going through the journey at a similar pace and level to what you are. And because each of those experiences in our lives adds so much value to us, that's why they deserve our respect. Now, it's natural, of course, for a person to respect a teacher. That's natural. It's not necessarily always practiced, but at least we can understand why. This is the individual who's enriching my life. So there, Rabbi Elazar doesn't have to tell us, Yehi kavoid rabbecha, that there should be respect for your teacher. He doesn't have to tell us that, because that's self-evident. What he tells us about a teacher is something that wouldn't necessarily be natural. Moira rabbecha, that you have to have reverence for your teacher. Now, what does that mean to have reverence for your teacher? Now, anybody who's a teacher, if you ever teach anybody, you'll love this. And by the way, you could use this at home as well. You can use this on your kids. So effectively, what does it mean, Moira Rabbach Moira Shamayim? What does it actually mean? That you should have reverence for your teacher as you have reverence for heaven itself, for Hashem himself. I mean, how dare we compare a human being to Hashem? How can you even say such a thing? So what's the practical application? Let's think about this for a second. Out of reverence for Hashem, what's the one thing that we always know, like it or not, that we have to do when Hashem says something? What do we have to do? Follow. So, has it ever happened that you've encountered something in the Torah and it doesn't really make sense to you? Ever happened? Happens. Has it ever happened that you encounter something in the Torah where you feel maybe it would be easier to share this with other people if it was presented in a different way? Ever had that? Right? So what do? Do we now say, okay, we're upgrading, updating, editing the Torah to conform to modern sensitivities? Is that what we do? Right? Is that what we do? Say, listen, once upon a time the Torah believed in values and morality, but now they're not so popular anymore, so I'm sure the Torah will accommodate. We don't do that, right? An observant Jewish person doesn't do that. Moira Shamayim. We have a sense of reverence that no matter what we think, no matter what we understand or don't understand, it's technically irrelevant because we know that Hashem is exponentially, infinitely beyond our understanding, so we accept. We accept with what we like to call in the language of Torah, Kabbalas oil. We accept Hashem's authority without necessarily questioning. Moira rabach kemoira shamayim. The reverence that we're supposed to have for those who teach us Torah is the same kind of reverence. Kemoira shamayim. That means to say that if they say things to us that don't necessarily make sense to us, we have two choices. The one is we can turn around and say, old-fashioned rabbi, what do they know? Or we say, moira rabach kemoira shamayim. There has to be a certain acceptance that this is an individual who is in a position where their knowledge is far deeper and greater than mine, so I have to accept what they say, even if I don't understand it. Now, big disclaimer over here. Big disclaimer. You have to first know that they are suitable to be rabbach. They have to first have proved their credentials in some objective arena that they should be considered a rav. So, for example, let's just use an example we can all relate to in today's world. There's this new app that we want to develop because it's going to make a lot of money. So it's called the Shaila app. Basically, the Shaila app works as follows. You type in the question, you type in the answer that you want, and the app finds you the rabbi you should ask. So what's wrong with that picture? Okay? In other words, you know what sometimes people forget? Is that Moira Rabach, the idea of a sense of reverence, is core within Judaism. There's a lot of Judaism that is joyous. There's a lot of Judaism that is loving. There's a lot of Judaism that is inclusive, but never at the expense of reverence for truth. And so that's why we carefully choose those individuals who are supposed to be the custodians of truth. So yes, I might be making light of an app, but the truth is, in today's world, how does it work? Let's be honest. What happens when a person has a shaila in today's world? When a person has an halachic question in today's world? You know what often happens? People will post on some WhatsApp group, for example, does anybody know what is the halacha in this case? And then you get everybody and their grandmother giving an opinion about what the halacha should be in this case. That is not moira rabach. That is not reverence for the principles of a teacher, of a guide, of a rav moire hoira'ah. That there's an individual whose job it is, because of their qualifications and the fact that they're recognized by their peers as the custodian of halacha. If you don't have reverence for that position, you'll be shopping around and getting 15 different views on every single thing that you ever want to do in your life. So moira rabach kemoira shamayim, in the same way as nobody would question the authority of the Torah itself, so there are individuals that we appoint as our halachic guides, and we accept what they say with a sense of reverence, rather than, okay, well, I have another opinion, and I also know a rabbi, my friend also has a rabbi. And before you know it, everybody is doing, as it says in the book of Shoftim, ish kol hayoshar beinav yaseh. Everybody does as they please. So when it comes to a teacher, we don't have to be told respect, because we are respectful, and we get up and we greet all the teachers, but then we shop around. Reverence is that you accept that there's a singular authority, and each individual has to have in their life a singular halachic authority that is non-negotiable. When it comes to your peers, when it comes to your friends, then you could say, listen, we're all friends over here. We don't necessarily have to have some unusual element of respect. I'll have the same kind of respect that I have for every other person. Because as a Jew, I'm supposed to be respectful to everybody. So you happen to be my peer. We study together. So you add some value to my life because you have an opinion. And you learn and you give me a perspective that I wouldn't have had on my own. But I add value to your life. So we're kind of square. So we'll have mutual respect. Big deal in today's world is the sense of mutual respect. You respect me and my views, and I'll respect you and your views. So here he tells us that's all very well for ordinary society. But chaverocha, the person who's your chaver, your peer, the person who you experience the journey of Torah study with, they deserve an extra degree of respect, similar to the respect normal people would give just to their teachers. Because you have to value how much this person completes your life, how much they bring to you that you wouldn't necessarily have had without that chavrusa. As I think it's one of the most fascinating things. Have you ever looked at the difference between a university library and a yeshiva? It's one of the most fascinating things. Like, I would love to take every professor who thinks they're a big deal and bring them into yeshiva. For no other reason, just to see the horror on their face at the lack of decorum. Because how do you study in a university library? Shh. I'm in my silo, you're in your silo. I read my book, take my notes. You read your book, take your... There's zero peer review in the process. Maybe if you submit a paper, that will be peer reviewed. But in your actual study process, no peer review. Whereas in a yeshiva, you open your mouth, you say one word. The person across there, how do you know? Prove it. So the chaver, the person you study with, adds value to you consistently through the learning process. Therefore, they deserve a tremendous amount of respect. But the most fascinating of the lot is the student. Because the attitude of a teacher could very well be, remember, the principle we're using over here is that we all add value to each other's lives, therefore we owe each other respect. So the view of a teacher could be, I'm the one adding value to their lives, because I'm the teacher. And unfortunately, many teachers over the course of history have taken that approach, which is, I'm the repository of knowledge, you are to be the dutiful students, so I'll lecture, you take notes, don't rock the boat. And Judaism says the exact opposite. The honor that you give to your students should be as valuable to you as your own honor. Why? Because students solidify information and knowledge in a way that nobody else does, if you'll only be prepared to give them the respect of allowing them to speak. Allowing their perspective, their view. Now, this is a fascinating concept. It's a fascinating concept. First of all, just before we go there, I do also want to say that some of the Meforshim have a lovely kind of twist on this tale. Yehi kvoi talmidcha, when your student shows you respect. Right? Slightly different way of reading it. Yehi kvoi talmidcha, when your student shows you respect. Chaviv alecha. You should consider it something special. Don't just say, it's platitudes, whatever. They're trying to make me feel good because I'm the teacher. Recognize that if they show you respect, it means that you're having a meaningful impact on them. But the principle as it's really being taught over here, which is that you see a tremendous value in your students, is one of the most fascinating concepts ever. And this is where we'll try and drill down a little bit deeper. We'll see how we go with time, if we can get back to the Moira Rabbach again from a different perspective. But let's focus on this. Why do we say that students add so much value to teachers? It's a very famous Gemara. The Gemara says, I learned much from my teachers. I learned much from my contemporaries. And I learned the most from my students. Why? Why is that? Why do we learn the most from our students? Because they ask questions we would never dare to ask, right? And because they have an open mind, inquisitive mind. They have an inquisitive mind, right? Children have an inquisitive mind. Not all students are children, by the way.
Your growth comes from because they help you to grow.
They help you to grow, right? So let's understand why that is. Because this is fascinating. And it's such a large topic that it extends way beyond just the notion of parents and children, or teachers and students. It extends all the way to Hashem and us. Because in the relationship, we are the students and Hashem is the teacher. And whatever happens right across the whole spectrum. This is a fascinating topic that effectively talks to the issue of why did Hashem create us anyway? Does he need us? Does Hashem need us? Does Hashem need anything? He's perfect, he's infinite, he doesn't need us. So why did he make us? You know why? Because of this principle. Because there's a value that students bring to the table that even the teacher doesn't have on their own. Okay, this is a huge topic, which we probably cannot do justice to in the time we have this morning, but we'll start. We're going to start this way. What's the difference between a human and an animal? Humans think, yes? Humans think. And animals also think. Maybe they think in a lesser extent than we do, so no animals are looking to put animals on Mars, but maybe that's taka because they think better than us. I don't know. Choice, right? Tselem Elokim, in Hashem's image. What does it mean to be in Hashem's image? So what did you say? Speech. How do I know that? Because in Torah literature, when we describe the 4 types of life that exist in this world, we call them in ascending order. We call them doimeim. Now, how do you translate doimeim? Inanimate, yes? Or more correctly, how do you translate it? Still or silent. So that's their whole mineral world. The next level, more developed life form is called tzomeach, that which grows, the plant kingdom. The next most developed life form is the animal kingdom. What do we call the animal kingdom in Torah literature? Chai. Because it's truly alive. What does it mean truly alive? It doesn't have to be plugged in. Plants are only living when they are plugged into their source, whereas an animal can move freely. So it's actually got, so to speak, independent life. And how do we describe humans? Medaber. That means that the Torah identifies that the uniqueness of a human is the capacity to communicate. There's a big difference between speaking and communicating. In other words, how many times have you ever heard a variation of this theme? But I told you, you never told me. Have you ever heard of a variation of that theme? That's the difference between speaking and communicating. Speaking means I say something. It does not guarantee that the other person hears anything of what I have to say. Medaber does not mean the capacity to make communicative noises. Animals can do that too. It doesn't mean that you could speak. It means that you can communicate. Now, what is the key of communication? What is the single way in which communication really works? What's the one secret to make sure you actually communicate? Putting what into your head?
No, you've got to know exactly what you're saying and be precise.
So you have to know what you're saying to be able to communicate. Because if you don't know what you're saying, how could you possibly communicate it? It's like we used to joke always in yeshiva that when a person was busy sharing a vort, and in the middle of the vort they would say, the whole idea is, we understood that that was code for, I don't know what I'm talking about. So when you start using these kind of fluffy expressions, if you're clear, you don't have to use any expression. You're just saying what you have to say. So that's a very important part of communication. You have to know what's in my head, what am I actually communicating, what else? What's even more important than that?
Listening.
In other words, you have to know and understand who you are speaking to. So if a person had to, for example, walk into a room of vegans and decide to use as a metaphor shechting, you're not going to be heard. So you have to understand, who are you talking to? What do they care about? What do they know? How do they think? And that's why so much communication breakdown occurs between men and women, because naturally we don't think along the same lines. So naturally we assume, when I said this, you should have understood that. That's the power of teaching. The power of teaching is that when you are able to communicate in the language of the student, that has allowed you now to break out of the existing thought patterns that you have always had. Because your students don't have the same thought patterns as you, and they don't have the same things that you take for granted. Those are things they don't take for granted, perhaps don't even know at all. So when you're teaching somebody else, it forces you outside of yourself, and that's when you really start to learn. The chap of teaching is not only that the students ask questions, and those questions might be things you've never thought of. Any teacher will tell you that the act of teaching, even before anybody asks any questions, is already illuminating, because it forces you to have to see things in a way that you wouldn't naturally have seen them. So if you respect your student, if you respect your student, meaning to say you respect their world, you respect that they may see things differently, you respect them enough to understand who they are, then you are enriched to be able to learn in a way that you would never have learned before. Because it's natural for a person to go down the path of least resistance. So if this is what I know and this is what makes sense to me, I'll consistently find that in the course of my learning. Whereas when I have to force myself to explain something to somebody else who doesn't see things that way, who doesn't come from the same background, it forces me now to examine from a new perspective. And that is metaphoric for Hashem and the Jewish people. Hashem has a certain respect, if we could use such language, for us. Because Hashem sees the world through divine lenses. And in divine lenses, obviously the whole world is a holy environment. And obviously the whole purpose of existence is in order to do mitzvahs and bring the world to a holy place. But we are not wired that way. We don't look at the world and automatically see godly energy floating through the windows. We look outside and say, oh, what's the weather like today? Are those kids still making a noise? What time is my next appointment? I think my phone just buzzed. That's how we look at the world. So when we in our world are able to learn the messages of how holy the world is and what the intention of the world is, that adds value that wasn't there before. It adds a dimension to the holiness of this world that isn't just because Hashem said so, it's because we've worked through it. And that's alluded to also in this Mishnah, Kavod Talmidcha, that there's this tremendous, if we could use the expression, tremendous respect that Hashem has for us, not because we're greater, God forbid, than He is, not because we could achieve something that He cannot, but because we are designed to discover learning in a dimension of reality that Hashem Himself doesn't, so to speak, experience. If we could use, got to be careful how you use those expressions. So it's an incredibly powerful thought for us, that ability to break the mold and step beyond what already exists, and that's where the real value lies. Which part?